Surely it would be an expression of ingratitude on my part not to express my appreciation for the kindness of the introduction. A person always has conflicts within himself, I suppose, when he hears things like this, when he realizes how much more he could do or how much better he could have done what he's been doing. But I do appreciate the confidence expressed and the kind words. We're grateful tonight for the presence of each one of you to come to consider the subjects that are before us, both very important, as are all the topics in this particular lecture series. We're hearing a great deal nowadays about conscience. Medical doctors are having probings of their heart, their consciences about some events that have transpired within recent weeks. But these, in principle, have been with people who have been treating diseases ever since the profession had its origin. And all of us have to make decisions in moments of crises and in moments of conflict that involve our awareness of what we believe is right or what is wrong. The term conscience in English simply comes from two Latin words, one of them of which means together or with, and the other one which means knowledge, or it is joint knowledge or knowing together with something. This is exactly the two words. This set of words is the same set in the Greek. One, soon, which means together or with, and the other one, oida, meaning to know. Those of you who have an outline, there's a mistake in it. The word should be O-I-D-A. So that actually then, literally, the word conscience means a knowing together. But a close study of the Bible indicates that there is more than simply a knowing together with something. There is also the idea of awareness, which we express by our word consciousness. So basically then, the word means joint knowledge or knowing together with oneself. It is the awareness by which an individual is able within himself to examine what he has thought, what he contemplates doing, or what he has already done. The word is used 30 times in the New Testament, that is in 30 different passages, but there are 32 different uses of it. Paul uses the word 19 times. It's used 5 times in Hebrews, 3 times in 1 Peter, 2 times in the book of Acts, and 1 time in the Gospel of John. And it doesn't even appear in some of the versions in the Gospel of John in 8:9. So then basically conscience is an awareness by which an individual is able with himself to know, to be conscious of that which is transpired in relation to a standard which he accepts as being the norm or the rule by which he ought to conduct himself. Now the subject says conscience, conflicts, and crises. By the word conflict is meant in the context of this talk tonight a mental or moral struggle occasioned by incompatible desires or aims. When in the course of a person's life he comes to a point of decision making, and in the making of the decision there goes on in him a struggle when he contemplates his own desires, his own aims, in relation to what he believes is required of him with reference to his standard of right and wrong. Now these conflicts hit a person daily. They are real. By a crisis, we simply mean a decision or a judgment. And used in the context of this lecture, it simply means an emotionally significant event in an individual's life which denotes a decision in relation to what one believes is right and in relation to what is his self-interest. And the individual really comes to a juncture point at which a decision has to be made, and he goes either to the right or the left or maybe straight ahead. There are various alternatives that are presented to him. And he faces a crisis, that is a moment of decision, in which he has to make up his mind as to what he shall do. Now the major crises in an individual's life come when conscience demands that which contravenes either his lust or desire, his self-interest, and or human authority. Now we very frequently run into problems with reference to government, with reference to people for whom we work. For instance, a person might ask us to do something which would be dishonest in the particular labor we're involved in. And the individual, therefore, has a self-interest in maintaining his job, but at the same time he has to live with himself in relation to the awareness of what he believes is right or wrong. And at the same time, he is here under authority that he's placed himself under, and he has to satisfy all of these, but the primary consideration ought to be his conscience of what he believes is right and what is wrong. Now, in a complex society such as ours, an individual often succumbs to pressures, and he ignores his conscience. Any one of you in the assembly tonight could tell probably of situations in your own personal knowledge when people have ignored conscience, or maybe when you have ignored your own conscience. And so in a complex society that has many interrelations, such as ours, the occasions for such conflicts are multitudinous. They're so numerous that to catalog them would be rather boring. But you can imagine many of them. Moral and spiritual decisions are made with frequency. And often it is difficult to honor the conscience because of the opposing and conflicting forces and the power or powers that are working in a given situation. If you stop, write down on a sheet of paper at night when you're about ready to retire, the number of decisions you made that day involving conscience, you would be utterly amazed. And then raise the question with oneself, suppose I had no conscience. Suppose other men had no conscience. What kind of world would I live in? What kind of society, what kind of environment would I have? But in studying what a conscience really is, I believe it wise to classify the conscience and then to type it. The first classification of conscience I want to talk about is that of an antecedent conscience. This is a conscience which precedes a decision. It's the operation of conscience preceding the decision to act. When possibilities are being considered, and an individual has come to a juncture point, he's come to a point of making up his mind about alternative courses of action, and he sees these courses of action in relation to what he believes is his moral, spiritual, ethical obligation in that situation. So he reflects on alternative 1, 2, or 3, and says, now, if I make this decision, there are certain forces that are brought to bear by my intellect. There are certain situations here in the context in which I find myself. What shall I do? Then, at the point he is considering these courses of action, there comes into play this monitor within him, this moral judge called conscience, that will pass judgment on what he is considering. Now, one's awareness of right or wrong as applicable to the contemplated situation then comes to the front, comes to the fore, to pass judgment on the alternatives for action that the individual is contemplating. And very often a person will say, I cannot do that. My conscience will not let me. Now, in this instance, he considered an alternative, and his conscience therefore operated preceding the act, when it was merely a matter of his conscious consideration. His intellectual processes were all that were involved. On the other hand, all of us have experienced a situation when an action has already been completed and we are contemplating it, looking back over the situation, and are rather alarmed at what we did. We are rebuked by the conscience. This one is called a sequent conscience, or one that operates subsequent to a decision made or a contemplated action, or completed action. Now, an individual sits down, reflects, and decides, I am going to do this. Once he's made the decision, he said, well, I overlooked something. And his conscience comes into play, and he says that decision to act was wrong. Sometimes we go ahead and complete the act, and once the deed is done, we reflect again and say, I was wrong. And consequently, we may go to a fellow and apologize for something we said, or apologize to him for some deed done that was not in his interest. There are other ways of classifying conscience that might be more precise. One would be to classify a conscience as judicial. That is, it is functioning in the process of passing sentence. And when an individual, therefore, decides or has done something, the conscience comes into play, or he's trying to decide what to do, and the conscience comes into play to pass a sentence on the contemplated action, the decision made, or the deed done, whether it be good or bad. Sometimes we may speak of a conscience as being punitive. In this respect, we mean that it pricks us. It reprimands us for what we have done, which we believe in relation to our standard is wrong. So in that sense, you would classify a conscience as being punitive. On the other hand, it is sometimes considered to be executive, in the sense that it assists an individual in arriving at a decision. I think all of us would shrink from life in which we had not the benefit of conscience, had not the benefit of this moral governor or monitor within us. We don't want to think about existing without that. So in that sense, conscience occupies what we would refer to as an executive office in an individual's life in assisting, enabling him to make up his mind, to make decisions, and to direct the various members of his body or the total body in doing a given act. Now, basically, what does a conscience do? How does it function within a man? All of us recognize, so far as the Bible teaching is concerned, that we have a fourfold nature summed up in the general word heart. There is the intellect with which we perceive and with which we reflect, with which we reason and arrive at logical argumentation. In addition to that, there is the emotion with which we feel that gives emphasis to what we're doing. In addition, we have a will by which we are able to determine and to persevere. And then, in addition to that, there is the conscience part of us that passes judgment on the thought processes and the execution of the thought processes over here in some course of action, say an act of theft. Now, the thought processes were behind the act of theft that was performed with a member of the body. But we sit in judgment on both the thought process and the act done. So that when we begin to look at conscience, I believe we can say that there are four basic functions of a man's conscience. The first function is that to bear witness to what one is aware of in his own heart or mind. Now, this particular aspect of conscience is overlooked. And if you read most of what has been written on conscience, you don't find too much emphasis on awareness. Now, some of the modernistic works, such as the Interpreter's Bible and others, do give attention to this, but in a wholly wrong context, is my conviction. But I'd like for you to study for just a moment the second chapter of Romans and notice what he speaks of in respect to this matter of being aware of in connection with the Gentile world. When you said, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness therewith. Now here is an awareness within the individual that there is something that his intellect has perceived and that his rational powers have arrived at as being the standard by which his life, his thoughts should be governed. And there is, therefore, in him an awareness of what he perceives, what he understands, and what he decides to do. So he said, their conscience bearing witness therewith, and their thoughts one with another, accusing or else excusing them. Now here is an awareness within an individual when one thought and another thought come up. Here is an awareness of what he has received or accepted to be right. Here's an awareness of what he is thinking that he might do or what he's already done. And therefore his conscience comes in to play the part of the judge, to pass sentence on something, but first he must be aware of it. So there is within the element of conscience, the idea of consciousness or awareness. And the awareness, therefore, is in relation to a standard or to what is the reality in the case. Now, some of the experimentation I'm sure that Dr. Branch will talk about tomorrow evening has indicated that one can take electrical stimuli and apply it to a brain, that is the physical mechanism, and the individual is aware that he isn't doing it. Though he may be having the thought or the reflex may be moving a particular part of his body, he's aware of the fact that he's not the instigator of it. There's something inside the person that's independent, really, of the physical mechanism. You can make him move his hand, his arm, or some other part of the body, and also have him to recall, for instance, something in his childhood that under normal circumstances, the electrical impulses of his own brain wouldn't be strong enough to pull out. This is a tremendous faculty of the heart to be able to become aware and to be aware and constantly aware of what is going on inside oneself that's independent of the contemplated thought. That is, here's one thought over here to do something, here's another one over here that's aware of what that one is. Now, in the second place, the conscience assists an individual in making decisions affecting a person's relationship to God, what he considers to be right or wrong. There are three illustrations of this in the Bible that I'd like to consider. The first one's in the 13th chapter of Romans with reference to civil government. An individual contemplates his relation to that human authority. And in verse 5, he said, wherefore you must needs be in subjection, not only because of the wrath or the punitive power of the government in executing whatever the sword does. he bears not the sword in vain, but also for conscience sake. Now here is a situation in which one's ability to determine right and wrong comes into play to assist him to do something. Now the first verse it said, let every soul be in subjection to higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Therefore he that resisteth the power withstandeth the ordinance of God, and they that withstand shall receive to themselves judgment. Now a Christian aware of that and believing not only obeys government because he wants to shun or prevent the wrath of the government's being expressed against it, but on the other hand, there is a demand within his moral nature which we ascribe to conscience, which the Bible ascribes to conscience, that says you must do this or else you are condemned. So the apostle said a person should obey civil government not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of or because of the demand of his conscience. Now in that instance, the conscience moved the man to do an obedient act to a human authority, because he is aware of the fact that this is demanded of God, and he's aware of the fact that he believes that this demand of God is right, and therefore to contravene it is wrong. And since he does not want the punitive action of God or the government, he therefore proceeds to do what is required. Then in 1 Peter 2:19, we have a different situation, but still a human authority. In this instance, it is one's relation to his employer. And the problem arises in labor unions. It arises in management. How am I going to respond to these situations? What is my conscience going to do in this conflict? Suppose an individual is under a person as a superior who is violent, who is forward, who is harsh and bitter and mean. What's his obligation? Well, in 1 Peter 2:18, 2:18 he points out, servants be in subjection to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward, for this is acceptable if for conscience toward God. Now here is an awareness toward God the individual has, by which he accepts from God a standard, and he then relates himself to God by this standard. If for conscience toward God a man endures griefs, suffering wrongfully. Now you can't think of a situation wherein self-interest, wherein desires, selfish desires, lust, and wherein human authority bring on a person any greater emotional trauma in the workaday world than the situation described right here. That the individual faces the endurance of a wrong when he faces that which would bring to him personal anguish, and yet his conscience demands of him that he behave so as to bring on himself these griefs, so as to suffer these wrongs, just as Jesus did in relation to human authority because of his conscience toward God. Then in addition to that, in 1 Peter 3:21, there is a passage I want to consider for just a moment. when he speaks of baptism and says, which also after a true likeness doth now save you, even baptism, not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but the interrogation, or one version puts it, the appeal of a good conscience toward God. Now here an individual obeys God, and his conscience is involved. And he obeys God in order to have a good conscience. It's an appeal of a good conscience toward God. That is, he wants his conscience not to condemn. What you did is what you should have done. Now in the third place, conscience does something else. It has another vital function. It passes judgment on one's own as well as the conduct of other people. Now in the 1 Corinthian letter, there are discussed principles of our dealing with certain classes of people who are brethren, as well as those who are not. And their conscience is involved and ours is involved. I'd like you to look at verse 28. But if any man say unto you, this hath been offered in sacrifice, eat not, for his sake that showed it, and for conscience sake. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but the other's. And then somebody's ready to raise the question, and he just raised it for them. Why then? Why is it the case that my liberty is judged by another man's conscience? Now my conscience had to pass judgment on the other fellow's conscience, what it was, if I were to do what the apostle said. And therefore my behavior would be with respect to that man's conscience. And I would make a decision on the basis of what I understand in this standard. My behavior should be in relation to that fellow on the basis of his standard. And so then my conscience not only passed judgment on me, but it likewise had to look over here and pass judgment on the other fellow's conscience. What his was in relation to what he believed was right. In Acts 23:1, the apostle said that he had lived in all good conscience to that very day. And 24:16, the same idea. He said, I verily thought I ought to have done many things contrary to Jesus of Nazareth. Now here is a man who, looking back over his thought processes and looking back over his actions, said, I always did what I was aware of being right. And I cannot recall in my life when I did not behave as I thought I should have behaved. Consequently, here is a judgment passed on his own conduct. In the 8th chapter of John in verse 9, some versions have conscience in that particular passage. American Standard doesn't. J.B. Phillips translates conscience there. When Jesus wrote on the ground and he made the statement, those of you who are without sin, you cast the first stone, and when they became aware of their situation, they got up and left. Their conscience passed judgment on them, and they just got up and left. In Romans 2:15, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men according to the gospel that he preached, those Gentiles will have thought of accusation or thought of excusing. Now that's passing judgment on what one has done. If there's an accusation, you're wrong. If one is excused, you are right, according to the standard that the individual accepted. So that's another function of conscience, to pass judgment on conduct, whether it be a matter of conduct in thought or act. In the fourth place, conscience is that which causes an individual to be aware of his violation of his standard, be aware of the fact that he did sin. Now in Hebrews 10, the American Standard and most versions translate that, if those sacrifices could have removed sin, there would have been no more consciousness of sin. That's the same word that in other passages translated conscience. But I think everybody can see immediately that he's using the term meaning to be aware of, that here is something of which the person is conscious, of which he is aware, that comes into his reflective processes so that he knows himself in proper context. Now in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 11, the apostle uses the word, I believe, in the same sense as it is used in Hebrews 10, when he speaks of the fact that he hopes that he is manifest to their conscience. Knowing therefore the fear of the Lord, we persuade men, but we are made manifest unto God. That is, God is aware of us. He knows exactly what we are. There isn't any question about whether God's aware of what they are. And he says that we are made manifest to God. And I hope that we are made manifest also in your consciences. Well, the point is that he hoped that it was clear, that it was evident, that it was exposed to their consciousness, to their awareness, that this is the way he behaved, that he did behave in the fear of God. God's aware of it, and he said, I hope that there is that awareness within yourself. But he used the word conscience to talk about it. Now let's look at conscience from the standpoint of what the Bible says with reference to the various types of it. You might want to type these differently, but I have listed 5 different consciences. The first one appears in 1 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, in verses 7, 10, and 12, and is referred to as a weak conscience, a very difficult concept to get hold of in order to understand all its preciseness of meaning. But as I understand it, this is a conscience that does not have the strength to cause one to act according to knowledge on the one hand, or on the other hand, it is a conscience that cannot make proper distinctions in judgment because of a defect either in knowledge or in perception. Now we sometimes speak about some people being much more perceptive than others. They have access to the same knowledge, and so far as reflection on the same set of facts, they haven't. But one is a lot more perceptive than the other one in seeing the relation of this knowledge to the situation that he's considering. But a weak conscience evidently means that the individual does not have the strength to cause him to act according to his knowledge. Now in 1 Corinthians 8, there were some people who knew better, but didn't do better. Well, that's a weak conscience. That is, one not strong enough to cause a person to act as he ought to act. But on the other hand, there were some people who, being used to offering things unto an idol, do eat as unto an idol, and he might have some imperfection in his knowledge or his perception.
So I believe that if we talk about a weak conscience and talk about it properly, we have to look at these three different aspects of it. That is, it is one that doesn't have the strength to cause an individual to act according to what he knows, or it's one that cannot make proper distinctions and judgment because of either a defect in his knowledge or a defect in his perception. Now, on the other hand, an individual can have what is referred to as a defiled conscience. Now, the word from which defiled comes originally meant to stain glass. It's a pollution or contamination is the basic idea in the word. Now, a conscience that is defiled is polluted or stained by a violation of the standard accept. Now, whenever an individual accepts the standard and then he violates that standard, he contaminates or pollutes, and if he keeps that up, if he keeps that practice up of violating his conscience, he'll contaminate and pollute it to the point that it becomes inoperative under what we classify as a seared conscience. Now then, an individual may have a defiled conscience. In 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 7, when he talks about a man's conscience being defiled, is when it's offended. Now, I think there's a point overlooked here by a lot of brethren. If an individual's conscience is defiled by doing an act, it can't be because he didn't know the act was wrong. You see, he pollutes and contaminates his conscience in the violation of it. And there's an individual that had some knowledge. Now, he may have been too weak to act according to his conscience, and he therefore would have a weak conscience. But he defiled it when he violated it, when he offended. And there are a lot of brethren who say, well, what you do is offending me. What they mean is I don't like it. A man is offended when he is caused to do that which is sinful, when he does that which is wrong. And some people would say to you, you offend me, and then you say, well, would you do that because I do? I wouldn't do it, he answers, if you and everybody else in the world did. Well, you didn't offend it in the sense of that passage. Now, the conscience may be defiled, therefore, by an overt, concrete act. But on the other hand, Titus 1:15 talks about defiling the conscience by intellectual pollution and unbelief. Now, an individual can contaminate his conscience through the intellectual process in coming to believe error or disbelieving truth. Here then is an intellectual defilement of the conscience, through the defilement rather of the conscience through the intellectual processes and through unbelief. And the apostle points out that even their conscience is defiled. Then there's a third type of conscience that we might refer to as an evil conscience. This is a conscience that is a wicked or bad one. And the only remedy for that, according to Hebrews 10:22, is to be cleansed. We have our heart sprinkled from an evil conscience. That's the one that has upon it the mark of sin. The conscience that has been in sin, that's wicked, that's bad. And the only thing that can cleanse it is the blood of Christ. And once that cleansing takes place, the individual is aware of the fact that he is now in a good conscience rather than an evil, wicked, or bad one. whereas those who offered the sacrifices of the law according to Hebrews 10 still had a consciousness of sin. Here, the heart is sprinkled from an evil conscience, and on the basis of Hebrews 9:15, it's by the blood of Christ. So here is something that happens in redemption, in the removal of that which is evil or bad, and replacing it with that which is cleansed and therefore good. Then in the next place, there's a type of conscience referred to as a seared conscience. Now this is a conscience which has become insensible to moral and spiritual discernment through persistent violations of it. And the apostle points out in 1 Timothy 4:1 and 2, that these people who forbid to marry and command to abstain from the eating of meat, which God has given to be received with thanksgiving, to them that know and love the truth. And he talks about their consciences being seared. Now to sear something is to make it insensible, the nerve endings insensible, to pricks and so on. And the idea of the metaphor apparently is this, that an individual violates his conscience repeatedly to the point that it does not come into the play to make decisions, to pass judgment, and the individual therefore becomes insensible to that which he considers right and wrong. Then finally there's another type of conscience referred to as a good, pure, or void of offense conscience. The apostle said he had determined to keep his conscience void of offense in Acts 23:1. Now this is a conscience that is respected, that is not violated. It's a conscience that is aware of the fact that the individual in the choices he made and the actions he did honored his conscience. He didn't contravene it. He didn't ignore it, but rather lived consistently with it. Now an individual ought therefore to keep himself in this. In 1 Timothy 1:15, I think it is pointed out that an individual can be ignorant and unbelieving and have a good conscience. He said, I did these things ignorantly and in unbelief, but he said I was the chief of sinners. Now an individual ought to recognize the fact that even though his conscience might approve of what he does, this doesn't necessarily mean that he is right. It only means he has behaved as he thought he should. But what he thought he should do might be wrong. There are numerous passages that deal with a good conscience. Now I'd like to turn to some observations or generalizations that I believe can be properly derived from what we've studied. In the first place is the teaching of the Bible that any element or aspect of truth learned or error discarded affects conscience in its reaction to behavior. Any aspect or element of truth learned or error discarded, or you could go the other way and say any element or aspect of error belief will affect an individual's conscience in its reaction to behavior. Paul's life is an excellent illustration. In the 9th chapter of Acts, he's a persecutor. Near the close of the chapter, he is converted. He's turned and his behavior is antithetical to what it was before. But in both instances, he had a good conscience. Now there came into his consciousness, there came into his thought processes a brand new standard. Instead of being an impostor, Christ is the Messiah. Instead of being one who is not the Son of God, he is the Son of God. And immediately, the point at which he had that change of conviction, he had that change of assessment of his behavior. Prior to the point that he came to believe that Jesus was the Christ, he said, I verily thought I ought to have done many things contrary to Jesus of Nazareth. But the minute he believed he was the Christ, everything he had done was wrong when he had opposed Christ. And therefore he started out on a program of action designed to honor the Christ. But he did them both with a good conscience. Then there's a second thing. It's imperative that an individual have the right standard so as to permit the conscience to play its most productive good function in an individual's life. The individual wants to make certain that what he has perceived with his understanding and has accepted on the basis of evidence which his mental processes have passed judgment on, that this is right. He ought to say to himself, I want to make doubly sure that I know this is what God says. Because if he is a man who has integrity or holiness and lets his conscience operate as it ought to operate in keeping it good, his whole destiny depends on it. And it's a fearful thing. It literally scares me every time I get up. If you want to check me anytime I ever talk, my palms are wet. There's a nervousness, there's a tension about it. Not because I'm frightened, but because I am literally scared of making a mistake in what I believe in practice. My soul depends on it, and anybody else who may listen to me, who may be in some way affected by what I say, will have his destiny altered accordingly. That's the reason I believe James says, one reason, since we can make mistakes with our tongues, we ought to be careful and be not many of you teach. Not saying to us, don't teach, but saying to us, you be careful. And not only that, but my destiny hangs on it. Your destiny hangs on it. And when a man is dealing with the souls of men, he's trying to influence their thought processes by which they arrive at right and wrong, he's dealing with the most precious thing about a man. And he's dealing with something that he ought not to tamper with. And this business of throwing together lessons and not reflecting on the context of the passage and things of that kind ought to be one of the most frightful things that ever hit a person's conscience. It scares an individual who really understands. It's frightening when he sees the implications of what he's doing, both to himself and to other people. Then there's another generalization that we ought to take note of, and that is that whatever a person's standard is, he should live consistently with it. People can misunderstand this and say that a person says that if you believe what's wrong, you ought to do what's wrong. No, that's looking at it wrong. The individual cannot afford to fear, to ruin that in him that passes judgment. He destroys an essential part of his being, his conscious being, when he does that. So then the apostle said in Romans 14:23 that an individual ought to be assured in his own heart that what he's doing is right. That doesn't make him right, but he can't be right and ignore it. And such consistent behavior does not guarantee my being right, and Paul is the wonderful illustration of it. He lived with a good conscience prior to the time that he accepted Christ, but he said of that time in 1 Timothy 1:15, I was the chief of sinners. Here's a sinner, the chief of them, with a good conscience. But he did not violate his conscience, and that's one reason God could use him. He was a man who had integrity. The interplay of lust, self-interest, and human authority in a person's life in momentous crises speak one thing, and conscience may well demand antithetical behavior. Now, these crises will either break or make me morally and spiritually, and they'll break or make you too. Our society, as well as every society in history, is filled with conflicting demands, testing the will, the conscience, and the emotions, and the intellect. I don't know whether you've ever studied any about medical research or not. Sometime, if you have a little opportunity, go to a library and sit down. Read about some of the great medical discoveries. Read about some of the great scientific discoveries. Read about some of the great moral decisions that men of history have made. Get a good biography of these people. Read it. And from their papers, where they put down their thoughts, find what went on in their mind. And look at the tremendous conflict. Look at the crises. Look at the demands of conscience. And sometimes do that on yourself. It's a very helpful experience. Conscience is very much in vogue in the popular press as men now seek to justify behavior which deviates from the norm. And they do it on the basis, they say, of conscience. On the other hand, there are many people being moved by various pressures to conform to a new kind of nonconformity. People who demand their rights and march into a church and destroy everybody else's life on the basis of conscience. If there ever was a time that we needed to get our minds cleared up of some fuzziness in thinking about the nature and the function of conscience, is today. The desires involved are most important, and the demand is for clear understanding and perception about right and wrong, so that the conscience can in reality assess right. So there's no mistake in what you are aware of. And in conclusion, let me say that being endowed by God with the capacity of self-knowledge, we're the only animal that really has that in relation to a standard. You don't see a bird dog go around here and sit down and determine he's going to be better than a dog down the street. They just don't do that. Monkeys don't do that. No other animal does that. Man is the one who sits down and reflects about himself in relation to a standard. Now, since that's the case, and God endowed me that way, I ought to seek all the enlightenment I possibly can. It ought to be an urgent matter with me. Further, there should be a very diligent effort expended to keep the conscience involved in all conflicts and crises, because Clinton Hamilton's well-being, his personal respect, and his integrity are involved. Yours too, in your actions. And when I've lost that, I ruin myself. And because God's Word